This is a debate about control and who we want to afford that control to. Do we want to afford more control to those who already control the terms of contracts and control the future of their lives? Or do we want to afford control to surrogates, a group of people who are typically vulnerable, a group of people who are typically coerced, and a group of people who are typically exploited? Do we want to afford control to the people who are putting their bodies on the line, the people who need the money more than anything else and so will do absolutely anything to get that money? On Side Affirmative, we stand behind giving control to surrogates. We stand behind giving control to those without it. I'm going to do a few things in the speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, I'm going to explain the precise change in this debate and the circumstances under which people are likely to drop out of these contracts. Then I'm going to explain the benefits to those people when they drop out of those contracts and explain why we care about those benefits more than the pretty significant harms that we'll concede that side negative will bring with respect to these parents. And finally, I'll explain why this provides more leverage in contracts and during the terms of pregnancies to surrogates and why that's something we care about in this debate. Firstly, in setup, there's one thing I want to make abundantly clear. When we say that individuals will suffer no liability by dropping out of those contracts, that means they won't have to pay back any money that they've been paid thus far. It means that they won't face any legal repercussions, and we're happy for courts to stand by protecting these surrogates in the circumstances in which families might be aggressive or push towards them. We're happy to institute things like restraining orders or anything necessary to ensure that these surrogates are fully comfortable at any point in time dropping out of these contracts. Let's move on to the first argument of this debate. What circumstances do we imagine people withdrawing under, and why do we imagine those circumstances to be legitimate ones and ones that we care about? The first thing I'm going to do is describe a set of scenarios under which people in the status quo aren't able to drop out freely because there are certain restrictions being placed on them, either financial or otherwise, that prevent them from doing so, and explain why those situations are naturally intuitive ones in which we'd be willing to protect at all costs. The first situation is a surrogate who simply wishes to terminate the pregnancy. And notably, terminating the pregnancy might involve giving back a substantial amount of money that you've already, taken from these parents. Or terminating that pregnancy might involve getting involved in a lengthy legal dispute as to the future of that pregnancy or the nature of the money that you have to give back, even if you end up not having to give it back in the first place. Notably, that amount of pressure on someone, particularly someone as vulnerable as a surrogate, who are typically people from low income backgrounds who have no other major job prospects or are dependent on other people for their survival, can prevent them from engaging in that choice. Secondly, we would suggest someone might just want to keep the child. They, during that pregnancy, might form a bond with the child in their womb that they did not expect to have. And now that bond, being one of the most primal and strong that any human can experience, makes them want to keep that child. Under side opposition, that is something that becomes an enormously more difficult decision to make. It's very hard to convince a court that all of a sudden you ought to keep the child. And even if you do, you have to go through lengthy legal proceedings and give money back in the process. Those are enormous burdens on an individual who wants to make that decision. But thirdly, we would point out that there are just circumstances in which you learn more information during the course of that pregnancy that would prevent you from wanting to give up that child. Whether that be because you find out that the prospective parents are terrible people who would raise that child in really abusive and horrible ways, or whether that be, my apologies, or whether that be just situations in your own personal life which might compel you to keep the child or do literally anything else, whether that be a new financial windfall, whether that be a partner. It can be small circumstances, but circumstances that are relevant to making the decision as to whether continue with a pregnancy or keep the child or do literally anything else. All of those circumstances are clear circumstances in which the natural average person would say that person has a right to make that decision without significant encumbrance. Notably, side opposition does encumber them. We're talking about people who are being significantly coerced into making these decisions, whether it be financially, whether it be legally, whether it be directly through these families feeling the power to continue to coerce them, or surrogacy agencies putting pressure on them, saying that we won't give you work in the future, or we will take you to court over this. Those are the circumstances under which someone is being coerced under side opposition, where they would be substantially less coerced under our side. So with that out of the way, why do we think there are significant benefits to people in those situations for being able to drop out of these pregnancies or these surrogacy contracts? We think on two grounds we would support those decisions. The first ground is in principle, the second in practical. Let's explain the principle. The principle is very simple here. It's their body. They should get to choose what they want to do with their body. Incredibly simple, right? Holding a pregnancy or holding a child is something that fundamentally alters the way that your body works. It changes everything. It makes you more tired, it makes you more sluggish. It changes your hormones. So in a very basic way, you become a fundamentally different person for that period of time. If someone wishes to drop out of that, or if someone wishes to keep on to the child that they are bearing all of those costs for, that is something that we should absolutely protect. We don't think that any kind of contract can be enforceable to coerce someone into such extreme forms of their body being captured by someone else's interests. For example, sure, we allow people to work on dangerous work sites, but we would not have someone enter into a contract where once a day someone comes to their house and forces them to sleep for 2 hours and then vomit into the toilet into the morning and then prevent them from living a basic average life by providing them drugs that fundamentally change who they are. We would never allow such a contract. And if someone were to be allowed into that contract, we would absolutely allow them to exit that contract at any point in time. This is a debate about bodily autonomy, and it's side affirmative that stands for bodily autonomy. But secondly, we think there are significant practical benefits for the reasons that I detailed earlier, either because that pregnancy fundamentally changes their life by preventing them from engaging in other forms of labor or preventing them from engaging in other forms of rights acquisitions, or for the reason that they have to give up a child that they are substantially attached to. Both of those things have significant practical harms to the individual. So the question we need to ask ourselves in this debate is, which set of harms do we need to care about? Putting aside for one moment the fact that our side claims principally there is no circumstance in which we would allow a parent, prospective parents' rights to trump those of these surrogates, which ought we care about on practical grounds? Now, side opposition obviously has a sympathetic stakeholder here to some degree, right? Like these parents often spend years trying to find a surrogate, and it could delay their getting a child by another couple of years, for example. And that's substantial and that's harmful. It also could cost them a substantial amount of money. But there's a few reasons why we ought to care about the surrogate significantly more. Firstly, the principled reason we detailed earlier, bodily autonomy in this case is not something we're willing to trade off for any practical harms under any circumstances, so we're willing to cop that harm. Secondly, on the grounds of vulnerability, very clearly these surrogates are way more vulnerable. They aren't the people who have hundreds of thousands of dollars to give up to get a child through surrogacy. These are the people who need that money desperately or they will die. But thirdly, also for reversibility, someone covering the harms of having to carry a pregnancy to term that they didn't want is something that can never be reversed, whereas someone who did not get a child and lost some money can get that money back in other ways and can get a child in other ways. For those reasons, very clear why we should care about the surrogate. Let's move on to the final argument in this debate, which is about leverage, which is essentially to explain that the current terms of the contract that surrogates enter into are abysmal, and this very simple fix changes it substantially. That is pretty obviously for the reason that we provide more power to these surrogates, not only in the negotiation period, but also during the terms of that pregnancy. Notably, those contracts are bad in the status quo. That makes sense, obviously, for the reason that due to the power imbalance, these parents have incredibly little leverage, but also for the reason I pointed out earlier, which is that there is a significant harm to these parents, and they often are desperate, so they're willing to enter into morally dubious relationships. What changes? Firstly, you give these surrogates far more powers in writing contracts. Secondly, you're more likely to care for the surrogate during the terms of that pregnancy such that they don't want to drop out for any reason. But thirdly, you're also more likely to do research during the finding of that surrogate to make sure that they don't drop out, which leads to better matches for everyone. Naturally, we're aware that this is a system that can be potentially abused, but in a second, we'll explain in some detail why it's extraordinarily unlikely the system will be abused by surrogates and is far more likely to look the way that we describe. Like people who need savior, people who need to be saved, being saved by a system that otherwise would throw them to the wayside.
Cool. Can people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thanks. Sometimes planes go past my house and I don't know how that affects the Zoom. So if you can't hear me because of a plane, let me know so I can stop for the recording. Chill. Side affirmative sets up a lot of potential harms to surrogates, and sure, those are valid and incredibly upsetting for the people who go through them. But they also don't outline to you why the system screws these people over significantly. What we're going to do here on side negating is two things. Firstly, we're going to explain to you what surrogacy contracts are, the specific procedures in the law that are able to protect surrogates, and the developing ways that this fairly new industry is able to regulate and improve itself, and why leading to a ban is like a far too high step, or giving surrogates all that power. And secondly, we're going to explain the consequences of breaking those contracts and why they create specific harms, not just to individual parents, but to the system as a whole. Firstly, then, on what surrogacy contracts are and what they're developing. The first thing to say in this point is that the setup of affirmative claims restraining orders, and we on negating are fine to support that as well. If a parent is coming after you being incredibly stressful during that pregnancy, we think it is fine to enforce restraining orders in the same way that side affirmative does. We think that's fine to support. The next thing to explain then is general contract laws principles that currently exist under the status quo and how they're able to protect the worst instances. The first is frustration, which is when something happened that is different to what that was expected when signed. For example, in a high-risk birth defect pregnancy, that means that the risk to the mother is incredibly far more higher. Like a risk of injury or death or terrible life consequences is much higher than that was expected going into the pregnancy. That contract can be voided, or that contract can have workarounds in the same way that an ordinary contract would if something happened that was different to the terms that you believed when you signed, meaning that in those worst excesses that get discussed at side affirmative, there already are legal principles that mean that there are outs for surrogacies in dangerous situations where that is different to what they expected. But the second contract law principle is unconscionability, which means that courts are unlikely to enforce contracts where the content is genuinely absurd. I think clear examples of this are prenups, where, for example, people put clauses on the amount of weight that their partner can have, and courts are unlikely to enforce that because that's quite difficult, it's quite absurd, and not something that's expected of a reasonable human. I think if parents were going out of their way to coerce surrogates, it's quite likely the court would find that unconscionable, not something that someone could legally sign up to, and therefore the courts are not going to enforce the worst parts of those contracts, which means that I think the worst excesses that side affirming talks about are unlikely to occur. The burden on affirmative, therefore, isn't not to just show that some things are bad that happen in surrogacy contracts, but these are all extremely unconscionable contracts that should not be able to be signed and should not be able to give it away. We think that's not true. We think a clear way in which surrogacy contracts can be able to be, survived in the way that affirmative wants to, for example, if you want to terminate the pregnancy halfway through, is through things like penalty clauses to make sure that you're not forced to do something you don't want to do. You still have bodily control of your own body. It's whether you're willing to pay the outcome of that contract and give just compensation to parents who have lost a child they believed they were going to have, rather than just walking away from it with no consequences at all. The next thing to say under this is regulation. So not just the judicial side, but legislatorily as well. How is the surrogacy industry developed? And we think that, for example, prenups are different in different legislations. But for example, in New Zealand, they get struck at court levels if that legislation is not fair. Or consumer credit contracts, which can be quite predatory to vulnerable individuals, have legislation around that to ensure that banks have to have specific loan lending requirements, or they have to have specific interest rates that they can charge to people to protect those vulnerable groups. We think that's a much more fair system and much more likely to develop through surrogacy, as we've seen through the instances of termination insurance for parents, to ensure that if a surrogate terminates their child, they can have insurance for that child, rather than outlawing all surrogacy contracts and allowing surrogates to be able to terminate them without any cost to the parents at all. The next thing to say then is they tell you that maybe when they talk about on affirmative, when the kid is born, maybe they want to protect the child, maybe they just want to have it now, maybe they're worried those parents are going to be abusive. But we note that when children are born, this is no longer the domain of a surrogacy contract, but is a whole new set of laws, because it is no longer a child in a womb, but it is a child in the real world, which has a whole new set of laws, like how you protect children and things like that. Often in most countries, that's dictated by family or parent courts, which obey the laws on the best interests of children and would be able to make the decisions to take them out of abusive homes if they thought that the person who wasn't the surrogate was going to be abusive, or if it's unlikely that they don't have that sorted out in the contract and they don't have clear terms around that, they're able to find a compromise. Often they bring those people together in dispute settlements to ensure that there are fair contracts. But the most vulnerable actor in this instance is a living child who has a whole 18 years of development to go, a whole lot of influence on their life. And if they are stuck up in lengthy court proceedings because the surrogate does not want to let them go to a fine family, to a good family, because they've become attached to that child, we think it's important family courts prioritize the child over just the surrogate in that instance. The next thing then to say is that when they, on their side of the house, make all surrogacy contracts blanket unenforceable and allow the surrogate to exit at any point in time, it's not just those specific alternatives, but it means that all the instances that we talk about regulation getting better for surrogates to make sure that we can get the best out of a system which is notably imperfect but is working to improve, all those court cases that discuss the legal limitations of surrogacy contracts, all that judicial attention in legal papers, all that regulatory attention in working groups in Parliament means that no longer happens. And the laws now work on punishing and dictating, don't just work on punishing and dictating outcomes, but they supply guidance. They supply expectations of fairness. They show to make sure that there's a combination in the difference of ideas and work to creating similar outcomes for both surrogates and parents so that they can be on better grounds. That's like we talked about with family courts and dispute settlements, leading to much longer term improved outcomes, which will never happen on their side of the house and will lead to quite curable harms. But lastly, we say, if you think all that regulation can happen, if you think that can outdo the worst excesses, it's really important to weigh the actor of someone that side affirmative notices is going to be quite upset, but doesn't notice the exact extent into what that is. Second point then, on the consequences of breaking this contract. I think the weighting that it comes out at first affirmative does not matter if we prove in regulation points that we can successfully get out the worst excesses where they still have control over their bodily autonomy, so that principle way doesn't work. And the harms that happen to individual parents are significant. That's cringe, but whatever, as well. The emotional damage that occurs to someone, the loss when you thought a baby would be yours, the grief of missing out on experiences you thought you would have, but also the feeling of a second-class citizen, of someone who is not able to get pregnant on their own. Perhaps they're in an LGBTQ plus couple, perhaps they are just infertile, but they are always reminded they are different from the societal expectation of creating a family and always feeling like there is someone out to get them and they cannot have that child. I don't think it just turns them off from having a family for 2 years. These are incredibly expensive procedures and often people save up for a lifetime to have just one chance at it, and that is entirely gone on side affirmative's world. But the second is expectation damage as well. People incur financial harms like setting up a nursery or taking parental leave that also needs to be taken into account. These are not just privileged actors. They are people who are often treated as second-class citizens who also feel the deep emotional harm of losing a child. That is the same, but these people were expecting it for far, far longer. And the last thing to say here is about the harms of the system that will come out to Shah as to why this forces surrogacy to become much, much worse, why it means these contracts are trusted less. On a side where surrogacy works and everyone could benefit the most, to get money, to get a baby, you must side with side negating.
I assume I can be heard.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to begin by talking about surrogates, and I'll secondly talk about clients. Why do I begin by talking about surrogates? It's because forced pregnancy or the forced separation from a child which you do not want to give up is, I think, morally devastating and morally weighty in a way that I am not eloquent enough to articulate, but I think should weigh heavily on everyone in this debate. And I think it is a moral harm, which we explain very clearly at Olly, which indicates that we should err on the side of surrogates' interests as the starting point of this debate, even if some people exploit the system, even if meaningful harm is felt by clients. These are people whose bodily autonomy is being violated. They're people who are overwhelmingly financially vulnerable and in many, even if not all instances, financially coerced. Clearly, this opposition team has a great deal of work to do in order to explain why the people they care about are anywhere near the universe of morally as important or vulnerable as the people we do. Firstly, then, the first claim I'll make here is that surrogacy contracts are often extremely dubious. We get two responses here from the negative team. The first thing they say is, well, surrogates can be protected by contract law. The problem, I think, with this entire argument is that it assumes a characterization of the kinds of people surrogates are, the kinds of legal privileges or accesses they have, which is A, unproven, but also I think just not empirically true. If you look at, for instance, the majority of people who are surrogates, which are women in the developing world, for instance, if you look at just the population of surrogates across the world today, and they never prove why this is the case, why these are the sorts of people who can access legal defenses, why the courts that are in their countries are going to enforce those laws. I would note that even if the defenses they talk about exist, they're not necessarily true or enforced. Surrogates in many instances don't have knowledge of the kind of legal processes we're talking about. In many ways, even if it is illegal to do so, companies can threaten surrogates and prevent them from dropping out. But even if they have access to these kind of legal processes, often they're incredibly expensive and long things to fight. And you're going against parents who are often rich enough to afford a surrogate and also desperate enough to want a child. These are people who are going to fight for their legal rights to have your child, even if you have some nominal avenue to push back. But the final thing I'd note here is that even dealing with the most generous version of this case, which is like when, extreme harms are incurred or when the risks massively increase, you can drop out, that's still not good enough, because we say the kind of moral right you're dealing with, which is the right to bodily autonomy, is something we should be incredibly sensitive to, even in tiny changes of what you want. Even if there are not, for instance, medical risks that you would undergo by having this child, but you decide, actually, I don't want to have a parasitic relationship with this thing in my body anymore, that in and of itself, even if it wouldn't be viable in a court of law, should be enough to allow you to drop out of that pregnancy. The second claim they make, which has even less analysis, is about the fact that there is regulation of these industries. I don't think a lot of reason has been given as to why that regulation exists, and I think there are many reasons why it's likely that surrogacy, and in fact empirically true, is that surrogacy is incredibly poorly regulated. That's because it's often in the interests of states to regulate it very poorly, because particularly in states which have a high volume of surrogates and often like wealthy overseas consumers, you don't want to regulate that industry massively to step on the toes of like the wealthier Western parents who can afford those services. But often note that surrogacy is international. It occurs between countries in a lot of cases. It's pretty hard to regulate. It's not an industry in which the people who are vulnerable, that is the surrogates rather than the companies, have a great deal of political or lobbying power. Incredibly unclear that regulation is done poorly. I would note that what we propose is a law that is easy to access, that is basically universal, that maybe won't be applied perfectly in all instances, but is far, far more easily applied than accessing a complicated legal proceeding of the kind which they are describing. Note all of the characterization we give you about why surrogates are particularly vulnerable to exploitation, that they're undergoing a particularly unattractive job. You probably don't want to become pregnant with someone else's child unless it is the last financial resource for you, that it's hard to access information because you are probably not particularly well educated and so on, but also just because the information we have about pregnancy, if you're not someone who has become pregnant before, is often incredibly hidden. People don't understand the harms that pregnancy incurs upon people's bodies and upon themselves, because you're often preyed on by companies which, even if not evil, are interested in profit and efficiency maximization, because at the moment you have very little leverage because there's a very big supply of surrogates, but you don't have very much power in that market. Note that is leverage that we change because you're able to have power as the contract is being written and during pregnancy, which means that our claim is much more likely to be enforced. I note that it's overwhelmingly women who are doing this work, who lack in many instances economic and social power. You're dealing with desperate and rich would-be parents. All of that indicates that these contracts are not going to be written in the interests of surrogates, that surrogates will suffer. But the second thing to prove here is that even if the contract is established fairly, the impositions on surrogates' rights are huge. That's what I noted before, that the things we're dealing with, like bodily autonomy, are so principally important. We should be incredibly sensitive to people's wishes in these regards, even if contracts are established fairly, that it's a huge imposition on your body and self, that it's uncontrollable and scary, that it has a huge impact on your body, and that it also materially imposes on your safety and freedom in other ways, things like health risks, like loss of a child you love, like having to give up money to otherwise violate that contract. All of this indicates then is that we should care about surrogates, that they are deeply harmed on their side and they would be deeply benefited on ours. And at that point, we've already won. But secondly, then, let's look at the side of this debate that is more favorable to the opposition team, which is about clients. They say the rights of clients matter quite a lot because they're going to undergo a meaningful loss of not being able to have access to that child. And in some instances, clients might be sympathetic, see if they're LGBTQ. Of course, we don't contest that this is a meaningful loss for many people, that it will be deeply sad for you not to be able to access that child. But it's not a loss that is determinant in this debate for a number of reasons. The first thing I'd note is, as I explained before, that contract often is illegitimate. Even if these parents are not evil, they're entering into an industry that I think you should be pretty morally sensitive about. For instance, even if you are not an evil person and you are purchasing sex work, I think that's an industry where there are a lot of difficult moral issues to navigate, where there's a chance of exploitation. It is on you to be sensitive. It is on you to be vigilant about not doing something immoral. But secondly, we explained that your rights are just not massively infringed on. You're not having your own bodily autonomy violated. You're usually going to be wealthier because you have able to access the surrogate. You can have children in other ways through things like adoption or IVF or other surrogates who want to continue. Obviously, those things are difficult and expensive, but they are still possible. And I know that it's extremely unlikely that you are exploited by that surrogate. That's because becoming pregnant just to get some extra money or scam someone is obviously a huge risk, which most rational people would not undergo. You would not have to undergo an abortion, keep a child you do not want just to scam someone out of money. But I know that what this policy does is it encourages clients to actually do things that are in their own interests, which is, for instance, write contracts in ways that are more favorable to both parties, like giving surrogates a wage that increases throughout the pregnancy, right? Such that the surrogate gets money, but also you're not going to be totally, have your prospects destroyed if they opt out. It means you're much more likely to have a relationship with your surrogate and actually care about them, to decide and be more clear about what the matchup of surrogate and client should be. These are kind of better practices because these clients don't want to be exploited, which also mean that that surrogate is benefited as well. At the end of the day, even if these clients suffer in some instances, we do not think their suffering is particularly important. The claim that we hear finally touched on in the last minute of that speech is to suggest that maybe surrogacy contracts would be trusted less, and in some instances that would lead to worse outcomes, or maybe surrogate clients would behave worse. I just note that any argument to this effect can't prove that this is worse than the status quo, in which surrogates currently have very little leverage, in which they currently have no ability to withdraw or to threaten to do so in order to get leverage over their client. So even if in some instances a minority of people trust the system less and so act poorly, they can't act poorly with the law on their side, and surrogates have the law on their side to push back. What this means at the end of the day is clients, yes, maybe have a slightly less convenient industry in some instances, though I would explain that it probably makes the industry better by meaning that people actually pay attention to and are attentive to the kind of surrogates who opt in, that you actually get better matchups. But even if they don't, people who are vulnerable, who have their rights exploited, who have their financial livelihood exploited, don't on our side, and that's enough for us to win.
Am I audible?
Yep, a little quiet.
Okay, don't worry. I think I'll get louder in my speech. Tends to happen. Okay. I'm actually really glad that Sophie brought up that point about how there's such an imbalance between the surrogates that are typically found in the developing world and Western clients and parents that seek to exploit them, that their own legal systems and jurisdictions cater to the lobbying power of Western clients and parents, and therefore don't have the interests of these developing country surrogates at heart, because we kind of laid a little trap for them in this debate. To the extent that you now no longer have trust in your own system and your own legal system that currently is the driving force of moving surrogacy away from these exploitative environments and into your local and Western environments where there is far more regulation and far more control as a parent, now you flip that script and you actually encourage parents to have their control not through the legal system, because they have no control in the legal system, but have control through extrajudicial pressure and enforcement on women who don't know the law, who don't know that this contract is unenforceable, who you can use the full force of threats of judicial outcomes and taking them to court, to all the impact that Sophie had to say. So I'm going to start actually with my extension on how this switches consumption to jurisdictions with less regulation and more power asymmetry, and specifically switches it to extrajudicial enforcement, which is far worse than the metrics that they brought up themselves. Secondly, I'm going to explain on principle why actually they fulfill or they harm a very basic principle of trying to facilitate the agreement between two individuals, right? Because all of the analysis shows that there are parents that desperately want a child, and there are people who are willing to take a lot of money because they want that money and need that money in order to provide this service. And why not having an enforceable contract there, actually, in my first point, I'll show how it makes it way more harmful when it goes into extrajudicial areas, but not having that contract is a principal harm for both parties and actually undermines the capacity of either party to have what they want. Secondly, I'd explain why we provide the best balance in terms of the rights and responsibilities on either side when you actually have enforceable contracts, where the types of regulation in a new growing industry can actually build and have all the regulation and insurance schemes around it can only happen when there is a clear trust in that system and when there's contracts that can actually result in legal precedent being created. Firstly, then, on how consumption switches. The first thing to note here is that for the vast majority of history, a lot of the surrogacy was done in the way that Sophie describes, in the fact that there were not many in regulatory environments, so therefore it happened outside of regulation, and therefore it didn't happen necessarily in Western countries, but happened in developing countries that then, Western clients used to use. The reason that now it's shifting is because there's a regulatory environment that allows Western parents to have the best of both worlds, right? Western clients. They firstly have the ability to regulate because it's now accepted by their own legal jurisdiction and are able to have control over that process to the extent that there is some level of enforcement. But they also specifically have much better ability to have the safety of their baby under control, or are able to, for example, track the surrogate and make sure that everything's happening fine and help them and provide them money, which is less, that they have less ability to do this if the surrogate is overseas. The problem is, in weighing up these two incentives, most clients and most parents, or potential parents, definitely care about getting that baby in the first place, right? The safety of the baby doesn't matter to the first instance because a lot of those concerns can be mitigated by providing money to that surrogate, but also it's not as important if you aren't able to get that baby in the first place, which means when people are making this huge decision to change their lives, to take maternity leave, to ensure that, they've set up their finances for a baby, to actually take the process of deciding to have a baby, the biggest thing is there a system that means that at the end of this really lengthy emotional process, do I still have a baby? And that changes significantly on their side of the house because you remove all control from the parent, right? Not on their side. There's not a balance of power here or a balance of control, but all control to the surrogate. That means that they are less likely to go to local and Western surrogates, but more likely to exploit and enforce this on poor, unable to, just uneducated people that Sophie was talking about in developing countries. Why is this less preferable? Firstly, because you can have extrajudicial enforcement from the very mechanisms that Sophie brought to you, right? You can have literal physical intimidation by the middlemen in those developing countries. You can threaten legal action against them, and this legal action could be based on the contract where they don't understand, or it could be extraneous, right? It could be like denying them passports, denying them other forms of documentation, things that adoption services in the developing world are doing right now. It's very easy to see how that can be a source of enforcement when you no longer have the legal avenue that is far more regulated, happens in a public sphere, and can have those restrictions that we talked to at Aisha. You have none of those at all when you go through other avenues of pressuring these really vulnerable people, which shows that if you do care about the really vulnerable people that Sophie brought up in her speech, that actually the debate falls to our side, because we actually shift that consumption away from them and onto individuals who are more able, financially but also legally, to get those kinds of remedies and have an alternative on our side of the house. but it's also just made worse to the extent that there are much poorer people, they have much weaker and more corrupt institutions. So all of the harm they're talking about power asymmetry actually is emphasized on their side with the new form of consumption in developing countries, or the continuation instead of the change on our side of the house. But secondly, you can't even sue the parents if it's in that instance where there is no contract, but it's through extrajudicial means. There is no other form for the surrogate themselves to sue the parent if the parents back out or the clients back out, but also you don't have the health and safety regulation at all, which means that for the very reasons, all the reasons that we heard at Sophie, you definitely should on a practical level give the debate to us, because they, if you do care about vulnerable people being coerced, make it far more likely that vulnerable people are coerced in a way that there is no legal remedy for those people. Let's talk about principle. The one line we had from them is that this involves our body, and therefore we should have all control over your body. But Olly also concedes in his speech that there are instances where you can reduce your bodily autonomy and you can sign your bodily autonomy away, like doing dangerous work, right? And says, well, this is very different. You're forcing them to sleep. You're changing their biology. Can we just stop this weird dichotomy between like hormonal changes and things within your body and the physical world? It all connects, right? So if you work really hard in a dangerous job, you are likely to have health risk. You're likely to change your entire biology with the stress that your body feels. Athletes have to suffer TBI when they go and ram their heads against each other. These are all things we allow people to sign away. They say, oh, we don't allow people to directly inject hormones and then change their biology. We do. We have drug trials, right? The instance of all these things is having a regulatory structure around it to ensure that it works better. So here's the counter principle, right? The problem is that there's two parties that want to do something. We need to find a balance between them. The problem is that you need a lot of trust, right? And the government's responsibility is to facilitate that arrangement to ensure that there's fair dealings between people. Effectively making the contract unenforceable on side, affirming side, harms all parties, because no one can ever trust that process, because you never even want to go into that process if you know that you have no control at all. You're spending money without any guarantee of getting something back, which means that the fact that you're making this unenforceable is an unfair restriction on the government's part, on the side affirming's part, on individuals' bodily autonomy to do what they want with their body, because you're restricting both their parents' ability to get a baby, but also the surrogate's ability to use their body in the way they see fit. That's the important facilitating role that the government has, that they completely remove on side affirming side. So therefore, on a balance of principles, what you shouldn't do is remove everything away from the client and put it on the surrogate, because that doesn't solve the problem and actually breaks the level of trust. But you should have better regulation, right? You have all the things that ensure that the worst instances of surrogates having problems is something that's within the contract, within legal precedent. That never happens on their side. The third point, I think Aisha brought this up really well, right? Regulation is likely to happen on our side because it's not there as much in the status quo, because it's a new field. And therefore, as this new field progresses, you'll get that legislation placed around it. Look at all the examples Aisha brought you. You get legal precedent when this kind of interaction happens in court, but you get other systems forming around, like insurance schemes, for example, to ensure that there isn't as much of a harm when the contract breaks or kind of depresses the onerous on the surrogate. Note, on our side, we aren't forcing anyone to have an abortion. We aren't forcing anyone to have their child taken away. All we're saying is that the law should acknowledge the fact that a deal has been made and a service has to be provided, which means if that service isn't provided like any other contract, there just should be some compensation. And the level of compensation is much more equitable and will be more equitable only on our side.
Okay. Can I be heard all right there?
Yeah.
Beauty. All right. Shah said that we should treat this like any other contract, and that's not unreasonable. The easiest contract to treat this like is an employment contract, like a job, and you can quit jobs, and your employer cannot demand that you pay them extraordinary fees. Now, of course, there are some jobs where you can, but they are not typically the kind of jobs in which the people that are paid are people that have very limited amounts of understanding of the legal implications of the contracts that they sign, that are disproportionately likely to be making choices on the basis of large windfall sums of money in context of financial pressure, who are disproportionately likely to be young, who are disproportionately likely to be financially stable. Shah said that we shouldn't give all the power to one side in this arrangement, but in reality, of course, we should, because there is only one side that is pregnant. There is only one side that has a person living inside of them, or a fetus living inside of them, I guess. I'm going to look at three things here. The first thing I'm going to do is look at Shah's truly bizarre idea to implement a trap card and then spend 5 minutes on it, as if that was going to be, you know, like a way to win the debate. Then I'm going to have the actual debate. Firstly, looking at how coercive this is, and then looking at the consequence that's going to be traded off. So firstly, as best as I understand it, the argument that Shah's making here is, well, if you reduce trust and kind of like reduce the attractiveness of the deal that is being provided by surrogacy providers in wealthy countries, they will, instead of buying into the less attractive option that we now create, apparently our option is significantly less attractive, and to a degree that's probably true, they will then move overseas. Okay, couple of problems with this. The first one is that Shah's, so it is obviously the case that it is much more expensive to do this in a wealthy country than in a poor country, okay? The reason at the moment, as Shah correctly identifies, that people would like to do this in a wealthy country is because the healthcare outcomes are much better, right? So if you were to just consider this on a probabilistic basis, right, choosing between going with the wealthy Western country option, where the person that you are contracting has the ability to opt out if they want to and may choose to, compared to the country that is run by a deliberately shoddy, deliberately by their characterization, abusive person, is a context in which you're not particularly likely to get a child out of that. Indeed, you may be the victim of fraud. The second observation that I would make is that the arrangement that the opposition describes sounds eerily similar to human trafficking, right? Which means that practically it's going to be at least in a grey area as it pertains to this Western country's legal system. And given that we're talking about a financial transaction in this context, in which we're still presumably going to be relying on the Western legal system to enforce if they just take the money and run, which seems to me like would be the most likely context here, right? Like it's most likely that the thing that Shah describes is just going to be a company will offer that they're able to provide this sort of surrogacy service, and then they just rug pull on you, right? That's much more profitable. Just take the deposit and run away with it. And of course, your legal system is not going to provide you with any assistance. But the third thing that I want to say here is that Sophie gives plausible explanation with literally no response as to why our model is actually not particularly unattractive to people. Because all that you need to do is create a contract that creates consistent incentives for the people that are participating in it to do that, right? Like all that you need to do is create an incentive based on ongoing payments, based on a relationship of trust with the surrogate, such that the surrogate is motivated to take the child to term. It means that you want to make sure that the surrogate understands. And sure, that might take a little bit more time, might cost a little bit more. It is not so drastically different that you would be willing to undermine the health of your child or risk being the victim of a rug pull. So I think that argument doesn't really work. Now let's go on to the second question, and I think this is the dominant question in this debate. Is this policy likely to mean that a non-trivial number of people are forced to carry pregnancies to terms that otherwise they would choose not to? Because if the answer to that question is yes, it is very difficult to imagine the opposition winning due to the horrifying implications of an argument in which the opposition are forced into the corner of effectively being forced birthers. Not that I think that that isn't their intention, but if this mechanism plays out the way that is the consequence that they must bear. We describe three reasons. The first, we are talking about people who do not have the financial capacity to participate in this system at all. Notably, the opposition believes that the compensation that should be paid needs to be significant. Either it is the amount of money that they have already been paid, or it is enough to compensate for the hurt and suffering that they've incurred. One thing that we heard is the idea that you need to be paid back for the construction of a nursery. It's clear the opposition is thinking about thousands of dollars, and the people that we are talking about participating in this system are people that do not have tens of dollars in their checking account a lot of time. It is simply impossible, and so it is likely that this would often be compelled. Secondly, the legal concept here is horrifying, right? Many people who do not have assets are absolutely horrified by the prospect of getting into draining and expensive and terrifying legal actions in which they could lose everything in addition to all of the costs they would incur, right? That is a credible threat that the enormous power asymmetry that this industry creates between the very wealthy clients and the very poor workers are largely incapable of reconciling. And we know that that threat all the time discourages people from taking this sort of action. But finally, Sophie explains in a great deal of detail why the companies that do this, even in the West, are likely to be scummy and are likely to give a misrepresentation as to the rights that these people have under these contracts. What does the opposition tell you? Firstly, well, there's frustration and unreasonableness. Firstly, that assumes that it gets to court. Secondly, that assumes that you, a pregnant woman who is attempting to procure an abortion on short order, is capable of affording a lawyer to enter those things or knows to do so. Thirdly, they are dubious in this case, right? It is not frustration when it is unexpected, because it may have been unexpected to you, someone who didn't think through all the full implications, but it is not necessarily an unexpected consequence of pregnancy. as a consequence of that, I think it's quite clear that this will, of course, compel a reasonable number of people to hold on to pregnancies that they would other wish to terminate. And as a result, it incurs all of the costs that Olly describes that the opposition, kind of like just tries to trade off against. But I think they're sufficiently horrifying, they should be cared about. Finally, what does this do to prospective parents? So the first observation that I want to make about everything the opposition says here, because the argument they're making is like, well, yes, those things you describe are very bad, but there are some edge cases that we can throw out the window. And hey, look at the trade-off, okay? Sophie already gave you 2 reasons that weren't responded to at all about the nature of this trade-off. The first thing that she told you is that practices are highly likely to be changed in order to significantly diminish the number of times in which somebody would want to pull out. So this is in the first place a rare consequence. But secondly, that it is not particularly worth contemplating. And what I want to do here is look at the things that first negative said as the harms and just look at how they stack up. So the first one that we hear is that it would be emotionally devastating to lose your child. Now, the first thing I want to emphasize is that, forced pregnancy is just trivially kind of worse. And I think being forced to give up a child that has grown inside of you would also be worse. And I think the reason for that is that what the opposition is talking about is losing the abstract hope of having a child, whereas what is being discussed in the other case is of losing a child that has, been born inside, grown up inside of you, right? You have felt kick, that you have had enormous responses to, that you have carried with you, right? We just think that that's worse. But secondly, it may be devastating that it's repeatable. This is something that they never get over, that you incur the cost, that it stays with you for your whole life if you're forced to carry a pregnancy. But these people can always try again. And in fact, we know that many people, for example, try IVF multiple times. The second idea that we hear is this ludicrous idea of financial harms from setting up the nursery. Look, you can get insurance there, but also we're talking about wealthy people. I don't care. The worst argument, though, is the idea that this would reinforce to these people that they are second-class citizens because they're not capable of having these children. And I want to end here by noting the shocking asymmetry between saying that somebody would be a second-class citizen because they need to wait a little bit longer in order to hire a woman for 9 months to carry a child for them, and the amount you would be made to feel like a second-class citizen by being forced to carry a child to term, or being chastised by a court for wanting to get a termination, or indeed being not allowed by a court to do so. You would be far more a second-class citizen in the opposition's world, and that is why I'm very proud to propose.
Are you off now, Ben?
Yes, I will go and have some food.
Okay. Big love. Good to see you, buddy.
Take care. Good to see you.
Kia ora, am I audible?
Yes, indeed.
While the texture of this debate is more visceral, at its core, it is a debate about contracts. And I don't think, like Bij, that we should treat this as any contracts. In fact, it's quite rare for us to treat any contract with vulnerable actors as just any other contract. They're a contract embedded in a highly specific regulatory system with developed judicial precedents that guides the way in which we interpret and enforce them. Contracts and contract law is about channeling power. The opposition want this to not be about contracts, to not have any contracts, and instead leave those power dynamics unchecked. And all that is required under our side of the house is to have the type of judicial and legislative intention that does stuff like regulating and mandating that you have insurance so that you can compensate the damages for parents if you make a last-minute decision to abort your child, rather than under their side of the house to expose these prospective parents to the risk that their child is held hostage, to be torn away from them unless they fork out hundreds of thousands of extra dollars, as happens in international adoption cases every single year, or take these financially desperate people who really want surrogacy and deny them any of the systems that are necessary to have that as a financially viable system. Therefore, I will discuss three things. I'll explain the principle of contract and why contract is uniquely well suited to deal with these types of incredibly difficult situations where people have very personally held interests and need it to be reconciled and meted out in a measured judicial way. Secondly, I'll talk about why specific unenforceability rather than general unenforceability is what naturally develops when you don't try and invalidate all of these contracts and why that is likely to be far better. And then finally, I'll weigh then through the context of that involving regulatory environment, the consequences for surrogates as opposed to the consequences for these parents, and why in fact it is not the extreme things that the opposition brings back, but instead the very mild things they actually point to in Olly's speech, stuff like getting a new partner or having an unexpected financial windfall in which you make these impulsive decisions, devastate the lives of people who put hundreds of thousands of dollars and months of their life into the prospect of having a baby. So on principle of contract, and I note here that bodily autonomy is obviously incredibly important, but if you accept under their side of the house that you can just withhold money, because that's what they want, right? They want an ongoing rather than legally enforceable situation. Rather, you just build this course of conduct in which you offer someone money and then withhold money when they don't do things that you don't like. That's equally coercive if you accept that financial is coercive here. So what we are discussing specifically is court enforceability and court coercion, which is quite actually different to what wants to be described by the opposition. And I think this is the single thing that you need to understand. Signing a contract and then having that contract enforced is not forcing you to go through with something. It is like mind-bogglingly unlikely that a court would order specific performance of you having that baby. So what it would look like is being forced to pay damages or forced to make some other type of trade-off so that you can then terminate the contract on your own grounds. And what this does is it formalizes legal relationships in a really well-established and understood way. So instead of, and note for instance, that penalty clauses are banned in all commercial contracts. You can't say you would have to pay me $40 million if you do that. You would have to reasonably assess the harm to the individual. And if you as a person can't sign up to it, then that is exactly where the regulatory system is likely to step in, mandate you have insurance, or mandate that you aren't allowed to sign this contract. But note, contracts actually do deal with things that are incredibly personally held. So even if we were to accept that you are forced to do this thing or required to do this thing, which we don't think is the case, you do have to bear the consequences of terminating that contract, but that's not going to look like the court like marching you to give birth or to be a first birther. We do pay people to make themselves sick all of the time. We do it in medical trials, we do it in trucking, we do it in hundreds and hundreds of industries. And instead of banning all of those types of contracts, rather we build up elaborate legal systems that help us cope with specific risks of harm that grow too big. And if you just want to draw an analogy, this is why we're quite comfortable for the family court in validating any of those types of contracts about what happens to the child after they're born. We want them to prioritize the best interests of the child. But before that child is born, we're very happy to have that governed by the realm of contract with the countervailing duty of government responsibility, which we think more than balances this debate. So let's then look specifically, zoom in on what specific unenforceability means and why it's a preferable alternative to the general unenforceability they want to build. Two arguments from AF. Firstly, these people are legally and financially unsophisticated. Secondly, these countries don't have interests to regulate. And they point to a context that they say is incredibly common, which is the context of overseas surrogacy, which Beej then wants to tell you is not that common, and there won't be people who are tipped over into making that decision if we are like massively reduce the certainty that they have. I think that's deeply implausible. So what happens when you invalidate all these contracts? Why is it bad? Firstly, you lose the guidance of the law. Law is not just about enforcement. It's about formalizing legal relationships, gaining institutional knowledge about the way these things happen, and then making sure that you try and get optimal outcomes. And these are the types of like ways of fixing these surrogacy contracts that is hinted at in Sophie's speech, but we give you the actual institutions that spend the time and money and like very, very smart people to actually solving those issues and making sure that they're done through. So instead of it being like a for-hire system where the richest people hire very good lawyers and very good agents who make the best decisions for them, it becomes more accessible and it's a whole of government approach rather than a very specific approach only available to the wealthy. And what does that look like? For legally unsophisticated people, note they're not banning surrogacy contracts, they're just making them unenforceable. And if you try and explain the distinction for that to someone who's legally unsophisticated, when they get a letter from a lawyer that cost $5,000 just to write saying we will take your home unless you go through with this, you're not going to get to that court case. And of course, unlike the alternative, you don't have these courses actually going to court where they're publicized and everyone hears about them, where people realize what the limits of their rights are. You just get a very terrifying letter in the mail, which is exactly what we saw prior to the Me Too movement, when even if these rich people wouldn't win their defamation cases, it was sufficient just to raise the issue of them as a way to force people through. That's not a problem that gets addressed when you push these contracts under the carpet. Secondly, these people seek more alternative extrajudicial powers, and that money is stuff overseas, where you just have a middleman who forces this person to have a baby. And these middlemen are reliant on demonstrating a track record of getting the baby to the Western consumer. They are not going to be the fraudsters that are described by the opposition, though note, it is only the poorest parents who are desperate for a baby that might be forced to those alternatives. These will be people who are willing to put the interests of those prospective parents well over the interests of the people below them. Finally, you get no system development. You get no institutional knowledge. You don't get, for instance, the development of a family court that puts the best interest of the child first when deciding custody arrangements. You don't get regulations about insurance that make sure that no surrogate is put in the position of seeing a huge bill if they decide to terminate their pregnancy. These are the types of developments that only happen in a world where you bring the full attention of the judicial system, legislative system to bear, rather than allowing it just as the domain of the rich people to get the best arrangements for themselves and leaving everyone else to try and figure it out for themselves. So finally then, through this context, which is, it's incredibly important, it's just the baseline evolution of contracts which allows these surrogacy systems to deliver the best outcomes for individuals. How do you weigh the consequences in this debate? Firstly, extreme demands from parents under contract will not be a thing when you have regulatory agents that are willing to step in so that they're ethical, and you have these like broader contract principles applied to these types of contracts. There are obviously going to be places that are like worse than necessarily better, but we think what you get most out of the systems where you have a contract is accountability, and that is the single most important determinant as to whether these people go this ways. Then, of course, you have to deal with extreme demands from the surrogate parents. And if you just weigh how much this will cost to the expecting parent, you should weigh how much they're willing to give up in order to have that developed. And we know that in international adoption cases, people have been taken for hundreds of thousands of dollars not to have that child ripped away from them at the last moment. And that is the level of pain you are inflicting on these individuals. And then finally, of course, you destabilize the entire surrogacy system from within. There's no ability to have the trust of this relationship that for this investment, you will be able to likely procure something with fairness taken into account by a judicial body, rather than the whims of that parent, which could be something as simple as changing a partner or getting a financial windfall, as given to you in the first speech of affirming. You have that certainty. We are very happy to defend a system that does best for both these parents and the prospective parents.
Okay, cool. Affirmative pushes a binary on this debate that doesn't need to exist. You do not need to pick surrogates. You do not need to pick parents, because side negating gives you a world where the system works best for everyone, where vulnerable actors who need money so they can put food on the table have a system that supports them, that is safe for them, so they're able to do that. For desperate parents who want to be able to have a child, are able to trust a system to ensure that they actually get a child at the end of that arrangement. Obviously, neither of the systems, neither people are benefited in the status quo, but negating is the side that gets you to a world where both people are, where the world is improving, where making contracts becomes more equal and more fair. Affirmative is the side that destroys that world and destroys the hope of anyone for that system ever working ever again. 2 points in this speech. Firstly, on courts and regulation, and secondly, on the surrogates versus parents weighing clash. Firstly, on courts and regulations. I'd like to note here at Negative Reply that Affirmative never contests the way in which we outline quite clearly at first negating the way the system will get better, how regulation will improve it in order to make sure that we're able to get better regulatory frameworks, how courts enforce these contracts. The only claim they make to say that the improvements we make won't be as beneficial as we claim is access to that better system. And I think we have a few responses down the line. The first comes out right at the start, which is to say that for example, consumer credit contracts, we don't ban them from lending to vulnerable people because we accept that's still a system for them to be able to gain money out of or to be able to take loans. owns. Instead, we work on regulating those authorities in similar ways so that surrogacy agencies would be regulated, would be audited the way that banks are regulated and audited. And sure, I don't trust my bank most of the time, and I don't have to trust my surrogacy agency most of the time, because I know that regulatory framework exists that worsens the worst excesses of those harms. And I think that means that we're able to take quite a lead in this debate, because it seems quite likely that those agencies that everyone would be dealing with those systems, would be able to enforce the fair and legal ramifications that we step out. That access is probably provided to a large amount of people. But then Daniel quite cleverly takes affirmative to their logical conclusion and explains their mechanism of being scared of the law, not having access to the law, means that those people never get to court on either side of the house. They're too scared to ever terminate that pregnancy because they do not know that they are able to do that without any legal ramifications. They're still pressured by coercive parents in that system, and that agency is not as there to protect them because it's not as regulatory framed, because they think it's a one and done fix, and all that attention that we explain to you happens gets taken off that system. Those people get coerced on either side, and that harm there is symmetric. And the last thing they say here is, oh, we get good things on our side of the house. We created an incentive to make better contracts. Two things here. Firstly, we explained to you why it's much more likely that institutions are likely to do that over people, because they have regulatory frameworks, there's academic papers, there's pressure by the, like voting public, etc. But secondly, I don't think we get an explanation from affirmative why that would outweigh the fear you have. The fear that a child that is your DNA, your lifeblood, and the future of your next family will be taken away from you. I think that fear is damning, quite outweighing for people who read the news and see those surrogacy people feel like they're being taken away left, right, and center. I think it's quite hard for those people to just create better contracts. Lastly, then, this debate isn't about weighing, because we explained to you why we don't occur all harms to surrogates, but they force all harms to parents on side affirmative and don't have a way to come around that. If you want to give this debate on weighing, you should not be able to harm an actor that every side thinks is suffering serious harms when they suffer the loss of a child, not just a potential client. They're not just a child. Lastly, then, on weighing, even if you want to decide this debate on weighing, and I don't think you should, bodily autonomy is not a reason to do this, because they still have that bodily autonomy. They just have to pay some money back. That coercion is unlikely to be as bad on our side of the house. And if it's a power asymmetry, I think that gets quite clearly explained at Shah's expansion, why it pushes to the more vulnerable, more coerced stakeholders. Those parents are willing to give up everything. They're desperate, and they will turn to the third world if they think they're easier to coerce than people they don't trust on their home soil.
Killer. We explained that in the status quo, the reality is that a lot of surrogates are forced to carry pregnancies to term that they otherwise wouldn't, that they're forced to give up their body to someone who they don't really have a relationship with, and they're forced to essentially, fundamentally give up themselves. And that's a harm that side negative desperately tries to get over in this debate. And it's where I'm going to start this reply. I'm going to look at the various different ways in which they try to minimize and push away this harm, such that their harm of prospective parents lose their nursery money can take the debate. Let's look at the ways they do so. The first thing that they suggest is that the status quo is structured such that surrogates are already protected from the worst harms, such that really what we're talking about here is some disputes over a bit of money and a bit of legal proceedings. But notably, they still acknowledge that surrogates would be subject to legal proceedings or financial penalties if they terminate the pregnancies. And in fact, the term used by side negative's third speaker is they would have to bear the consequences of terminating a contract. Now, the characterization that we set up is such that that amount of pressure on an incredibly poor, incredibly vulnerable woman in a massively, massively asymmetric power relationship is enough to generate the worst harms of what we're suggesting. Because if you don't have the lawyer in that particular relationship, then you're forced to carry that pregnancy to term. If you don't have the hundreds of thousands of dollars to give back because you had to spend it on surviving, on paying for the treatments, on paying for the medical care, then you have no choice. You have to keep that child, or you have to give it up even if you want to keep it. So that first piece of mitigation, totally insufficient. The second piece of mitigation is to suggest that in the future, there will be more protections. And they suggest we don't respond to this. In fact, we do, and I'd have you refer to our previous responses. But the problem with this argument is that it is not actually a properly made argument. Firstly, there's no evidence to suggest that in the future there will be more protections, other than pointing to the fact that regulatory bodies at the moment care about contracts, and once contracts disappear, then they won't care about it. But that's an incredibly shaky premise, for the reason that, of course, the contracts still exist. You still have to negotiate the terms of payment, you still have to negotiate the rates of check-in, you still need to negotiate all of the healthcare involved in it. So these contracts still exist, so the very mechanism on which this argument is predicated doesn't exist. You shouldn't factor this into your decisioning. But secondly, we would suggest that even if there are more protections in the future, that doesn't suggest any reason to suggest that these very vulnerable people will be able to access those protections if they come with significant legal barriers, which is necessarily the case under a regulatory framework. But finally, we would suggest that even with those additional protections, what I explained earlier in this reply and what we explained down the case, which is that protections don't stop you if you're going to incur penalties, then those are penalties that you can't afford to incur and therefore your life is ruined, you're still stuffed. Their final piece of work here is just to say, well, on our side, it's still confusing. And in fact, it's even more confusing than a well-understood regulatory framework. So you still have to carry the child to term, or you still have to give it up. It's actually not. If you're able to withdraw from a contract at any point of time without any penalties, you don't have to contract a lawyer. You just have to send them an email saying, I'm withdrawing from the contract. Incredibly easy, would definitely be established at the beginning of the terms. So what are the actual harms they present to try to get over the enormous intuitive harms that we proved down the bench? The first thing they say is that, well, it's actually, we're just tearing up contracts altogether, and therefore parents get no control and no say over anything. But for the reason I detailed earlier, it's not that. You still get a contract, but even if you did, we easily outweigh that with the harms that we suggest that these surrogates will face, which, as we point out down the bench, clearly outweigh any harms that potential parents might face. They secondly suggest, no, actually the surrogates are going to be worse off, because now clients will turn to extrajudicial power in the developing world to control surrogates because they can no longer use the law in the developed world. Is this a plausible argument? Did side negative meet their burden to demonstrate this would happen, that expecting parents would now, where they otherwise wouldn't go to the developing world, now would, and they would contract extrajudicial means to force people to having a child, rather than just say adopt, or, you know, pay a little bit of extra money in the developed world, which is probably their revealed interest anyway? I would suggest not. But is that worse than the status quo? Because ultimately, it's just mitigation. If in the status quo, people in the developed and developing world have no power and we give it to them. The final thing they suggest is just that clients are harmed. But weigh that against the enormous loss of bodily autonomy and control. Even if they're doing it for frivolous reasons, like the third speaker suggests, I don't care. They still get control over their body. That's a fundamental principle we should never abrogate. Vote side affirmative.
Hi everyone, my name is Nicholas, and I will be giving the oral adjudication for this show debate. So I'll start with my decision. My decision was in favor of the affirmative bench. To illustrate how I came to that decision, I'll be looking at two questions. Firstly, are surrogates better protected by the motion? And secondly, is it legitimate that the affirmative bench is deprioritizing the interests of prospective parents in their speeches? Kindly note that I'll be using these two questions for assessing who won the debate, because these were also the two metrics used by both teams in measuring how persuasive each other's claims were. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about the first question. Are surrogates better protected by the motion? To illustrate how I came to the conclusion that the affirmative bench won this issue, let's summarize the contributions of negative. The negative bench here have two thesis statements. Firstly, they argue that the many examples of affirmative can be mitigated while keeping liability intrinsic in their contracts. They talk about three things to prove this. Firstly, they explain that there are legal principles that allow for contracts to be voided in situations where terms and conditions are unconscionable. Secondly, they explain that settlements and negotiations between parties involved in a surrogacy contract are still possible in the negative bench. They explain that these are valuable alternatives and that even in the worst case scenario, these are likely to just be financial damages as opposed to, for example, surrogates being forced to have a child. Thirdly and lastly, they explain that legislation and regulations surrounding these contracts are sufficient in protecting surrogates, and that these are also likely to be more fair for parties involved in the surrogacies, as things like child protection and family trials will still exist on negative for the cases of abuse that they want to avoid. The second thesis statement of negative bench is as follows. Negative argues that allowing for surrogates to withdraw without liability empowers harmful extrajudicial strategies, but also harmful trends in contract management. They explain in negative bench that when you make this contract unenforceable because you invalidate it, because you remove control from parents, then what you do is you actually empower these individuals, or you encourage them to go into exploitative methods for arriving at their desired outcomes. it looks like going into other territories where it's more feasible to deny passports, to intimidate the parties involved in this contract, or other strategies that are either more harmful or even harder to correct with legal means. They further explain that because of these strategies, you're likely to participate in territories where intervention is difficult. They even explain that for legally illiterate individuals who do not understand the extent of their rights, that they are put in a far more pernicious situation because regulators are now unwilling to participate in these contracts. Why was it that, despite the two thesis statements you get from the negative bench for this issue, I came to the conclusion that the affirmative bench still won? I think affirmative bench do three things to do this. Firstly, I think they're able to mitigate the safety nets introduced by negative bench. I think they do this in two ways. Firstly, they explain that in developing regions where these surrogacies are most prevalent, courts are discriminatory towards surrogates, and even if they are not, the power asymmetry between the vulnerable suggests that it will be difficult for them to negotiate, or even more likely, that the contracts were unfair to begin with. The second thing they explain is that in these regions, states have a perverse incentive to either not regulate or to even poorly regulate. They explain in government bench that because overregulation often reduces the individuals who participate in your surrogacy services, that you limit the sales and tax revenue when you regulate to the extent that the negative bench would want you to do. What is the conclusion then that I draw from these 2 points? I agree with opposition that regulations and legislations are more fair and viable alternatives than that which is being proposed by government. However, I think government bench are able to explain that when you consider the situation or the circumstances that surrogates often find themselves in, that these alternatives cease being viable, that they instead become tools that are used against surrogates, and therefore we ought to, for example, allow this motion to pass to give these surrogates something to even the playing field during these negotiations. The second thing that government does here is explain to me that it is unlikely that the illegal alternatives of opposition are going to be prevalent. I think government bench do two things to prove this. Number one, they explain by using an incentive structure analysis of the prospective parents that the trade-off between remaining in a state where the motion is observed is less than the trade-off that you would have to undertake in going to a territory where the harmful extrajudicial methods are feasible and prevalent. Why? Because it includes, one, putting your child in danger, but secondly, more importantly, that it is likely more feasible for you to stay in a country where these things are not possible. However, it's still possible for you to negotiate in the contract, to participate in the negotiation and the interactions between yourself and the surrogate, and that for these reasons, even though it is possible, for example, for these harmful methods to be adopted, that they are unlikely going to be the desired alternative of these individuals, that it is likely a drastic overreaction coming from these individuals should it come to that. But even if they do choose to go to that point, I think government bench explained to me that these individuals are also the same individuals who are likely to exploit the power asymmetry in regulation, exploit the discriminatory practices of the court, therefore explaining to me that in the worst case scenario, where it is possible and likely that these illegal means would be adopted, that the marginal change is minimal because on both sides, they will be using these methods to exploit surrogates. However, in the likely scenario, where these individuals, for example, still care about their children and still care about their integrity, that they are unlikely going to resort to these drastic measures, that they are either going to, one, not participate in surrogacy anymore, or two, participate in further negotiations with the surrogates to ensure that they're still able to maintain their ends of the agreement. I think what government bench does then is decrease the pervasiveness of negatives, harmful alternatives with this analysis. Thirdly and lastly, I think government bench are able to explain to me that even at the end of all these alternatives from opposition, that the power symmetry still persists, that other forces still coerce individuals into taking harmful practices. For example, the fear of legal costs when you don't uphold your contract, the fear of the lack of alternatives, that these are likely to be pressing relevant threats that only the motion can rectify, as even if there were good regulation, even if there were good actors participating, that these pressures are still likely to coerce individuals into opting into harmful practices against themselves. Therefore, the only alternative that can be done by the state to minimize these harms is to allow them this opt-out, to allow them this ability to withdraw without any liability. What is the synthesis of all of this? even if I agree with opposition that other viable alternatives exist. Considering the situation that surrogates find themselves in, I'm inclined to believe that these alternatives are not reliable. And secondly, even if I agree with opposition that there are drastic measures that can be taken, I have to be compelled by government bench to explain that these are unlikely, but more importantly, that the motion is the only alternative that allows for a fair amount of autonomy to be granted to these individuals such that they're no longer in a position where they feel coerced into taking harmful practices against themselves. For that reason, or for these three reasons, I was compelled by the affirmative bench that surrogates are better protected by the motion. Let's quickly talk about the last question. Is it legitimate then for affirmative bench to deprioritize the interests of prospective parents? To quickly talk about this, I came to the conclusion that the answer to this question was yes. Why? I think government bench or affirmative bench were able to explain to me that the consequences are not symmetric between surrogates and prospective parents. That even if we agree that yes, prospective parents will lose a lot when their prospective child is not born, or when they can no longer take custody of the prospective child, that the consequences to the body, for example, of the surrogate, if they're forced to continue with a pregnancy that they did not want to continue, is far worse, because this has permanent and material implications on their life, on their lifestyle, on their future work, for example, and that these are far harder to correct, far harder to rectify, as opposed to the emotional, immaterial harms that opposition undertake on their side. What is the conclusion then of all of this? Because government bench was able to convince me, number one, that surrogates are better protected by the motion, and number two, that the shareholder interests are better protected as well in government, that government was able to prove to me it is legitimate to deprioritize parents if it means we protect surrogates more. For those reasons, I was compelled that government bench won the debate. And that concludes my oral adjudication. Thank you all so much for listening, and I hope everyone has a lovely day.